All right, today we're going to be looking at the bryophytes, and bryophytes is a general term just referring to mosses and their relatives. You could also say mosses and their allies, and just like different countries have allies. They are non-vascular plants, which means they don't have the plumbing, they don't have the tubes, they don't have the tissues that are capable of transporting water high up into the plant. So that means that they remain small. And if you look at mosses, like in this picture, these are the mosses growing on a log and mosses growing on a rock, and they kind of look like carpet because they're made up of thousands of little tiny plants that can't grow very large because they are non-vascular. They don't have the vascular tissue to be able to grow tall and move water high off the ground. They rely on getting water simply by osmosis. The water just osmoses into their rhizoids. Rhizoids being root-like structures, so we can't call them true roots because they don't have vascular tissue. So the water just kind of soaks into the rhizoids and then soaks up into the rest of the plant by osmosis. That's one relationship they have with water, and the other one is that they rely on water, just like algae rely on water for sperm to swim to eggs. In the mosses, they also rely on water for the sperm to swim to the egg. So they typically are going to be living in areas where there's at least some rainfall for most of the year. The last general characteristic about mosses and their relatives, bryophytes, is that they reproduce with spores. So they're non-seed plants, or they don't reproduce with seeds and pollen like you normally think of when you think of a plant. So we describe the bryophytes as non-vascular, non-seed producing plants. There are three main groups or phyla of bryophytes. There are the mosses, the true mosses, which are in the phylum Bryophyta, and that's the namesake just for referring to all of them as bryophytes. But the phylum name Bryophyta strictly refers to those that are considered true mosses. Then there are liverworts, which are in the phylum Marcantiophyta, and then hornworts, which are in the phylum Anthoceratophyta, which is quite a lot of syllables. So the mosses, phylum Bryophyta, look like this, and if you've gone for a walk in the woods, I'm sure you've seen mosses all over the place. Then we've got the liverworts. Then the reason they're called liverworts is because they're leaf-like structures, and notice I'm calling it a leaf-like structure. It's not a true leaf because it doesn't have vascular tissue. These are non-vascular plants. So their leaf-like structure, also known as a thallus, it is kind of shaped like the lobes of the liver. That's why they call them liverworts. Then we have the hornworts, phylum Anthoceratophyta, and you can see very clearly why they call them hornworts. They've got these green horn-like structures that are coming up from the ground. So those are the three groups, Bryophyta, Marcantiophyta, and Anthoceratophyta, or the three phyla of bryophytes. And we're going to take a look at each one individually. So again, if you go for a walk in the woods, you've seen things like this all over the place. Mosses growing on branches, mosses growing on rocks. And what you're mainly seeing when you look at a moss, or when you look at mosses, are the tiny plants that are the gametophytes. The gametophytes are dominant. Remember, these show alternation of generation. Haploid gametophyte, diploid sporophyte. Haploid gametophyte, diploid sporophyte. Mostly what you're seeing when you look at moss plants growing in the forest are going to be gametophytes. They're the green dominant structures in the moss life cycle. There's only one image here where we're seeing the sporophytes, and that's these little spindly brown things that are sticking up from the green gametophytes below. Those are the sporophytes. So those are the two generations that alternate. And because mosses and other non-vascular, non-seed producing plants, because they are plants, they show alternation of generation. And in mosses, there are two visible, those two generations are visible with the naked eye. That's not true as we go along in evolution, as you'll see. As we go from the mosses to the ferns to the cone-bearing plants and then the flowering plants, that situation changes. The relationship between the gametophyte and the sporophyte changes drastically. So here we're looking at the bryophyte body. This is a moss. It's phylum Bryophyta. And if we start here down in the soil, Again, they can live in very shallow soil because they don't have roots. They don't have true roots. What they have are rhizoids, and rhizoids don't have vascular tissue. Water simply osmoses into the rhizoid and is passed from cell to cell to cell to cell up into the gametophyte, and that's the green part, the green leafy part. But again, you can't call them leaves; they're leaf-like, and that's what we call a thallus. But the water's moving up by osmosis only from cell to cell to cell, and that can only go so far. It can't go very high off the ground. So the green leaf-like structure is the gametophyte, which is dominant, which is mainly what you see. So that's what's being referred to here as dominant. It's the photosynthesizing part of the plant, or generation, I should say, of the plant. And then the sporophyte exists simply to produce spores, and it grows right out of the top of the gametophyte. So the sporophyte is a separate generation. It's a separate plant, but it grows right out of the gametophyte and is supported by the gametophyte nutritionally. That's where it gets its nutrition. You notice it's not green. It doesn't photosynthesize at all. So it relies on the food that's produced by the gametophyte in order for it to grow and produce spores. So if you'll recall, the gametophyte is haploid, right? Haploid gametophyte, and it produces gametes. That's why it's called the gametophyte. And the egg gets fertilized on the top of the female gametophyte, and then the sporophyte grows from that egg, and it is diploid. So that means it has to produce spores, which are haploid, by meiosis. Remember, anytime you go from diploid to haploid, that's through the process of meiosis. So we go from the diploid sporophyte to haploid spores, and that's what the sporophyte does. The spores then are going to germinate and give rise to a new gametophyte, which is also haploid. So the haploid spores germinate and give rise to the haploid gametophyte, and the whole thing starts over again. And of course, we'll be looking at the life cycle. So here we're taking a closer look at the liverworts. That's phylum Marcantiophyta. And again, they're called liverworts because the gametophytes that are low to the ground, the leaf-like structures, the thalli, look like lobes of the liver. At least somebody thought they looked like lobes of the liver. But those are the gametophytes. Then they put up these things called gametophores, which are also part of the gametophyte. But that's where you'll find the archegonia, which are the female egg-producing structures, and the antheridia, which are the male sperm-producing structures. And you'll see that that's going to be coming up on another slide, so don't worry about it right now. But that's where the egg is fertilized and gives rise to the sporophyte. So we're not seeing sporophytes in any of these images. We're not seeing sporophytes. They're actually, because the egg and sperm producing structures are actually under these little umbrellas, under the gametophores. So we can't see them, and we're not seeing any sporophytes growing out from under them either. But they do reproduce like mosses in the same way. The sporophyte grows from the female gametophyte and is supported by the female gametophyte, just like we saw on the previous slide. They also reproduce asexually using a form of fragmentation called gemmae. So they produce these little gemmae, and they produce them in gemmae cups. And so these are almost like plantlets that eventually get washed out by drops of water. So rain will fall, and the water droplets will splash the gemmae out of the gemmae cups. And those gemmae then, when they land on the soil, will start to grow and give rise to a clone of that liverwort. So of the three phyla of bryophytes, the liverworts are the most unusual because they have these gametophores and they have gemmae. The hornworts in phylum Anthocerasophyta are more similar to the bryophytes in that their gametophytes are low to the ground. So we can barely see them in this image because what's sticking up here, these horn-like structures, are the sporophytes, and the sporophytes are pretty large compared to the gametophytes. So if you look down here low to the soil, the gametophytes are all over the place, and then all these what look like almost like blades of grass that are sticking up are the sporophytes, and they're growing from the gametophytes, just like we were looking at of the diagram of the moss a couple slides ago. So although there are some differences between them structurally and also in the liverworts with the gemmae and the gametophores, they all reproduce sexually in the same way, and that's what we're going to look at next. So here we see the life cycle, and we'll start here with the gametophytes. So remember where the gametophytes come from are spores produced by the sporophyte. So really where we ought to begin is here. So the spores from the sporophyte, and those are produced by meiosis, if you'll recall, because the sporophyte is diploid, so these spores are haploid. They will germinate and give rise to what's known as the protonema, which is the young gametophyte plant, which is haploid. And because, the spores were produced by meiosis, so they were haploid, the haploid spores germinate into haploid gametophytes. And so they give rise to separate male and female gametophytes. And the sexual part of the plant is at the very top, at the very tip of the plant. So we've got the female gametophyte, which is known as the archegonia, at the tip of the female. And we've got the male gametophyte at the tip of the male plant. That's the antheridia. And so the antheridia will produce sperm. The archegonia will produce eggs. And those eggs will stay on top of the gametophyte and just wait for the sperm to come to them. And when the sperm swims to the egg, and that requires water, they have to swim in water, they have to swim in something. So that means that the tops of the plants have to be either covered in water, or raindrops will splash sperm from the male gametophyte to the female gametophyte. But either way, they depend on water for getting the sperm to the egg. And once the egg is fertilized, then it becomes a zygote, of course, and it begins to divide and develop into a sporophyte that grows right out of the top of the female gametophyte. And by the way, that portion of the archegonia where the egg develops and gets fertilized is known as the venter. So the venter is kind of like the womb or the uterus of the archegonia, the female gametophyte. So here we're continuing from the previous slide, but notice that we've gone, with fertilization, we've gone from haploid to diploid, right? Because the sperm and the egg are haploid, and once the sperm fertilizes the egg, we have a diploid zygote. And that diploid zygote is the sporophyte. So that's the beginning of the sporophyte. It simply divides by mitosis and develops into a separate plant, a separate individual, but it's growing right out of the top of the archegonium, or right out of the archegonium at the tips of the female gametophytes, and supported nutritionally by the female gametophyte, because the sporophytes are not photosynthetic. They're diploid, and they produce haploid spores by meiosis. And so that takes us right back to the beginning again, because on the previous slide we started with the haploid spores that germinate into the gametophytes, either female or male gametophytes. And that's the life cycle. This slide is simply to look at the whole life cycle together instead of on two separate slides, and to point out the alternation that's going on here. The alternation is between haploid gametophyte, diploid sporophyte, haploid gametophyte, diploid sporophyte. In their life cycle, they alternate between those two. But in mosses, bryophytes in general, mosses and their relatives, the gametophyte is dominant. It's what you primarily see, and is what primarily is photosynthesizing and producing food for the plant. So what good are mosses? Well, for strictly human use, there's not much use for mosses. We really don't eat moss. Other species do, so it definitely has ecological importance. There is an ecological importance. But as far as what we use it for, not a whole lot. If you garden, you may use peat, or there may be peat mixed in with the soil that you're buying from a garden supply. And what peat is partially decomposed moss, primarily sphagnum moss. So that's mostly what we're seeing here. It's probably the most common moss on Earth, the most common bryophyte. And it grows in bogs in certain parts of the world. For example, in Ireland, they have peat bogs where sphagnum moss grows, and it's a wetland, and so it's wet all the time. And sometimes a layer of peat will form over a pond, and you can actually walk on it, or a layer of sphagnum moss, I should say, and you can actually walk on it, but sometimes people will not even realize that there's no solid ground underneath, and they'll fall right through, and sometimes they even drown. So what we see here is a person that may have accidentally either fallen into a peat bog or was possibly murdered or experienced something that caused his death. And you can still see his hair here, and because he's so very well preserved. And that's because peat bogs are acidic. The environment has a very low pH, so it's acidic, which preserves whatever falls into them. So if a person's body goes in there, we end up with a mummy. So this is a peat bog mummy that was found in a peat bog in Ireland, probably when they were mining the peat. That's what we're seeing going on here. They're actually digging up the peat to be able to mix it into soils and so forth and sell it. Or sometimes that it is burned as fuel. When it's dry, and you can burn it like fuel, and especially in places where they have peat bogs but they don't have a lot of wood, they don't have a lot of trees to burn, they'll be using this as a fuel source. So that's it for the bryophytes. Mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. They are non-vascular, non-seed producing plants. Next time we'll be looking at the ferns and their allies, the ferns and their relatives, which are vascular. They're the first to be vascular, so they can grow larger, but they still reproduce with spores. And that's what we'll look at next time.